Pastor Jalen Whitmore was a respected man of faith, a devoted husband, and a loving father. Or so everyone thought. Behind the sermons and the picture-perfect marriage, he was hiding a betrayal that would destroy everything. For years, Jalen had been keeping a secret, one that involved someone in his own family. When his wife, Marissa, finally uncovered the truth, her world shattered. But instead of walking away, she made a choice that would take their family's pain to a whole new level, a choice fueled by rage, a choice she could never undo. By the time the dust settled, two shocking truths had emerged, and soon after, one of them ended up dead. But was it murder or something even more twisted? Stay with us as we uncover a story of secrets, revenge, and a crime no one saw coming. Jalen Whitmore was the kind of man people admired. At 42 years old, he led one of the most influential churches in his city, delivering powerful sermons that drew in crowds every Sunday. His words inspired, his presence commanded respect, and his family, his beautiful wife, Marissa, and their teenage daughter, Noel, was seen as the perfect reflection of his teachings. But Jalen's life wasn't as flawless as it seemed. Behind the polished image was a deception so deep that even he struggled to maintain the illusion. He had spent years balancing two worlds, convinced he could keep everything under control. One side of him belonged to the pulpit, his marriage, and the reputation he worked so hard to uphold. The other side belonged to a secret that should have never existed. The weight of his actions rarely surfaced in his day-to-day life. He had mastered the art of compartmentalization, separating his public persona from the reality behind closed doors. But what Jalen didn't realize was that secrets don't stay buried forever. The perfect marriage, or so it seemed. Marissa Whitmore had been by Jalen's side for nearly 2 decades. She had met him when he was just starting his ministry, falling in love with his vision, his charisma, and the way he made her feel like she was part of something greater. Together, they built a life filled with community service, faith, and family. But in recent months, Marissa had noticed subtle changes in Jalen. His late nights had become more frequent, his excuses more rehearsed. His sermons were still powerful, but there was something different about him, something distant, something hollow. At first she dismissed it. Ministry was demanding. Stress could weigh on a man. But then there were the moments that didn't make sense. The unexplained phone calls, the urgent meetings, the way he would flinch at certain conversations, as if guarding himself. Marissa had always trusted Jalen, but something in her gut told her that trust was being misplaced. One evening, as Jalen sat in his home office reviewing notes for Sunday's sermon, Marissa watched him from the doorway. He hadn't noticed her yet. His attention was fixed on his phone screen. She stepped closer, just in time to see him quickly lock his phone and set it face down. "Everything okay?" she asked. Jalen looked up, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just going over some things for church." Marissa nodded, but the unease didn't leave her. Something wasn't right, and soon she would find out exactly why. For days, Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Jalen's distant behavior wasn't just stress, it was something else. A woman's intuition was rarely wrong, and hers was screaming at her now. She told herself she wasn't the kind of wife who went through her husband's phone. But trust wasn't just given, it was earned. And lately Jalen had been acting like a man who had something to hide. So one night, as Jalen slept beside her, Marissa made a decision. She needed answers. Jalen was a deep sleeper. He had always prided himself on being able to rest in the Lord, no matter what was happening in his life. Tonight, that would work against him. Marissa carefully reached for his phone, her heart pounding. She knew his passcode, of course she did. But she had never used it like this before. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the screen. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Emails, messages from church members, calendar reminders. But when she scrolled further, She found the hidden conversations, and her entire world came crashing down. At first, Marissa expected to see messages from another woman, but what she found was much worse. The messages weren't from a woman. They were from her father, Bishop Warren Cadell, the man she had looked up to her entire life, the man who had officiated her wedding to Jalen. The messages weren't casual. They were intimate, coded, unmistakable. Plans to meet, apologies for close calls, whispers of things that made her stomach turn. Every single text confirmed the unthinkable. Jalen and her father had been hiding something far worse than infidelity. Marissa's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Her heart pounded in her ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She covered her mouth to keep from screaming. The man she had built her life with. The father she had trusted her entire life. Both betraying her in the most unimaginable way. Marissa put the phone back exactly where she found it and lay back down, staring at the ceiling. Sleep was impossible. By morning, she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't leave. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't beg. She would do something much, much worse. Marissa didn't confront Jalen. Not yet. Confrontation was for people who wanted closure. She wanted something else. Payback. As she went about her day, cooking breakfast, tidying the house, and pretending everything was normal, her mind raced. How do you destroy a man without touching him? How do you make a husband suffer in the most personal way? And then it hit her. Jalen had taken something sacred from her, their marriage, their trust, the foundation of their family. So she would take something from him, something just as personal. Her eyes landed on Noel. Noel had always been Marissa's greatest love. At 17, she was strong-willed, intelligent, and completely unaware of the storm about to hit their family. Marissa had spent years protecting her daughter from the world. Now, she was about to drag her into it. She justified it at first. This wasn't about hurting Noel. It was about Jalen. It was about showing him that if he could betray his family, so could she. It started subtly. Longer hugs, whispered words, little moments of blurred boundaries. Marissa knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just getting revenge. She was pulling Jalen's entire world into the fire. Marissa didn't expect it to escalate as fast as it did. One night, after Jalen had gone to bed early, she found herself alone with Noel in the dim glow of the living room. They were watching a movie, sitting close. Too close. Noel looked up at her mother with innocent trust. Marissa knew she should stop, but she didn't. Because this was never about love. It was about control. It was about watching Jalen's perfect life collapse. And in that moment, Marissa made the worst mistake of her life. A consequence she never saw coming. Days later, Marissa started feeling off. She ignored it at first, maybe stress, maybe guilt. But then the fatigue came, the weight loss, the nagging feeling that something was seriously wrong. A routine doctor's visit turned into something far worse. The test results came back. Positive. HIV. Marissa sat frozen as the doctor explained the diagnosis. She had been infected. At first she didn't understand. How? When? And then it hit her. Jalen. She remembered Jalen taking some medications that seemed strange. He claimed he just wanted to deal with the recurring headaches from consistent vigils. Meanwhile, she saw the same tablet on the doctor's table. She asked, and the doctor calmly told her what it worked for. Jalen had done this to her. A wave of nausea rolled over her as realization set in. But then, something even worse struck her like a freight train. If she had it, then so did Noel. She felt like she couldn't breathe. The room closed in around her. This wasn't happening. She needed to be sure. That evening, Marissa remained eerily calm. Too calm. She cooked dinner as usual, chatted with Jalen like nothing had changed, and even kissed his cheek when he left the room. But inside, she was dying. She convinced Noel to get tested under the guise of a routine checkup. Noel didn't question it. She trusted her mother. But when the results came back, Marissa's worst fear was confirmed. Noel had it too. Marissa stared at the test results in her shaking hands. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but she did nothing. Because this was her fault. Her revenge had destroyed the one person she truly loved. Jalen sensed something was off almost immediately. Marissa was too quiet, too controlled. She barely looked at him, and when she did, there was something new in her eyes. Hatred. Days passed, and the tension in the house became unbearable. Noel noticed it too. "Mom, is something wrong?" she asked one evening. Marissa just smiled and shook her head. "Everything's fine, sweetheart." But everything was not fine. The rage inside Marissa was boiling over, and soon it was going to explode. Because now, she didn't just want revenge. She wanted blood. Jalen sat in his study, flipping through notes for Sunday's sermon. He had no idea that tonight would be his last. Marissa stood in the hallway, gripping the cold metal of the knife in her hand. Her breathing was slow, controlled. Her mind was clearer than it had ever been. She had spent the last few days trapped in her own thoughts, reliving every moment that led her here. The lies, the betrayal, the way Jalen had ruined them all. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not this time. She stepped into the study, her shadow stretching across the desk as Jalen looked up. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, setting his pen down. Marissa didn't speak. She just stared at him, her grip tightening on the handle of the knife. Jalen frowned. "Marissa?" That was the last word he ever spoke. In one swift motion, Marissa lunged, the blade sinking deep into his chest. Jalen gasped, eyes wide with shock as he grabbed at the wound. Blood seeped through his shirt, spreading fast. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a strangled gurgle. He fell back, knocking over his chair, his hands scrambling for something, anything, to stop the inevitable. But Marissa didn't stop. She couldn't. She stabbed again, and again, and again. All the rage, all the betrayal, all the pain. She poured it into every movement until Jalen's body went limp, his eyes still open but lifeless. It was over, or so she thought. Marissa stood there, breathing hard, blood dripping from her fingertips. It wasn't until she turned around that she saw her. Noel. She was standing in the doorway, frozen, her eyes locked on the horrific scene before her. "Mom?" Her voice was barely a whisper. For the first time since this all started, Marissa felt fear. She had done what she needed to do. But now there was another problem, because Noel had seen everything. And that meant she might have to die too. Marissa stared at Noel, her pulse hammering in her ears. Jalen's lifeless body lay sprawled across the floor, blood pooling around him. The house smelled of iron and death. But right now, Marissa wasn't thinking about Jalen. She was thinking about Noel. Her daughter stood frozen in the doorway, wide-eyed, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had seen everything. For a brief, terrifying moment, Marissa considered the unthinkable. One more death. One more body. Then Noel did something Marissa never expected. She stepped inside, and she shut the door. Noel's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her hoodie. Her voice was barely a whisper. Did he deserve it? Marissa's breath hitched. She didn't know how to respond. Noel stepped closer, her face unreadable. Did he? She asked again. Marissa's grip on the knife loosened. Yes. Noel exhaled shakily, looking down at Jalen's body. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just nodded. Marissa took a slow step toward her. No one can ever know. Noel lifted her chin. Then we need to clean this up. Marissa blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. Noel wasn't running. She wasn't calling the police. She was helping. For the next 2 hours, they worked in silence. They dragged Jalen's body into the bathroom, stripping him of his blood-soaked clothes. Marissa scrubbed the study floor while Noel gathered cleaning supplies, her face cold and unreadable. When the house was finally spotless, Marissa looked at her daughter. "We need a story." Noel nodded. "A break-in." Marissa's heart pounded. "You'd go along with that?" Noel met her gaze. "I'm already in this. If you go down, so do I." For the first time since she had plunged the knife into Jalen's chest, Marissa felt a chill of something new. Fear. Because Noel wasn't just covering for her. She wasn't the same girl anymore. And Marissa had no idea what she had just created. The police arrived at sunrise. Marissa had called them hours earlier, her voice trembling as she spun the lie she had rehearsed with Noel. A break-in gone wrong. Jalen had been attacked, and by the time she found him, it was too late. Now, officers moved through the house, their radios crackling as they took photos, collected evidence, and dusted for fingerprints. Marissa sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, playing the role of a grieving wife. Noel sat beside her, staring at the floor, silent. A detective knelt in front of them. "Mrs. Whitmore, I know this is difficult, but we need to ask a few questions." Marissa nodded, keeping her expression carefully controlled. She had rehearsed this, but she hadn't rehearsed Noel, and Noel was about to make a mistake. Detective Harris flipped through his notepad. "You said you came home and found the door open?" Marissa nodded. "Yes, I knew something was wrong right away." Harris glanced at Noel. "And you were here the whole time?" Noel hesitated. "Too long." Marissa squeezed her hand, a silent warning. "Yeah," Noel finally said. "I was in my room with my headphones on. I didn't hear anything." Harris frowned. "Not even a struggle?" Noel swallowed. "I guess. I was really into my music." Marissa forced a small sob, redirecting attention. "Please, can we not do this right now?" Harris studied her carefully before standing up. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore, but just to clarify, nothing was stolen, correct?" Marissa nodded quickly. "Nothing." Harris closed his notebook. "Strange. Most break-ins don't end in murder unless the victim fights back. But Jalen didn't have any defensive wounds." Marissa's blood ran cold. She hadn't thought about that. Harris turned back to the crime scene, leaving Marissa gripping Noel's hand a little too tight. They needed to be smarter. For days, the investigation continued. Detectives asked more questions. Officers came back to the house, checking for details Marissa wished she had erased. Then, something happened that Marissa hadn't planned for. She overheard part of the conversation between the officers as she passed the kitchen. Fatal wound was clean, precise. No signs of struggle. Toxicology showed no substances in his system. Means he was fully alert when it happened. Killer knew what they were doing. This wasn't a random act. Marissa's chest tightened. They were starting to doubt the break-in story. She had gotten rid of the weapon, cleaned the scene, but she couldn't erase the truth, and soon they would figure it out. Marissa knew it was over the moment she saw the detectives pull into the driveway for the third time that week. She and Noel had done everything right, or at least they thought they had. But the police weren't backing off. They weren't treating this like a random burglary anymore. They were treating it like a homicide. She took a slow breath, turning to Noel. "Remember what we talked about," she whispered. Noel nodded stiffly, her hands balled into fists. But Marissa saw it, the fear in her daughter's eyes. Noel was breaking. Detective Harris sat across from Marissa in the dimly lit interview room. She had agreed to come down to the station voluntarily, anything to keep up appearances. He leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, we have some inconsistencies in your statement." Marissa kept her voice even. "I've told you everything I remember." Harris nodded slowly. "Right. But here's the thing. The autopsy showed that Jalen was attacked with clean, controlled strikes. That's not something we see in a chaotic home invasion, and then there's the fact that Noel claims she was home during the incident, but never heard anything." Marissa swallowed hard. She had headphones on. Harris raised an eyebrow. The entire time? Even when you screamed? Marissa's mind raced. Had she screamed? Had Noel said she did? She was losing control of the narrative. Harris sighed, flipping a file open. We also found something else. Blood, Mrs. Whitmore. Marissa's breath caught. We found small traces of it in the downstairs bathroom drain, Harris continued, like someone cleaned up. Now tell me, why would a burglar stop to wash up after committing a murder? Marissa's stomach churned. They had missed something. She kept her expression neutral. I don't know what you're talking about. Harris sat back. That's fine, because Noel is talking right now too. Marissa's heart nearly stopped. Across the station, Noel sat in another interrogation room, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the chair. She had rehearsed the story 100 times. She knew what to say. But under the cold stare of the detectives, the weight of everything was crushing her. She thought about Jalen's lifeless eyes, the blood on the floor, her mother's hands, covered in red. Sweetheart, the female detective said gently, if there's something you need to tell us, now is the time. Noel's lip trembled. She wanted to stay silent. She wanted to be strong. But then she whispered, it wasn't a break-in. And just like that, everything fell apart. Marissa barely had time to react before the officers came back into the room. The moment she saw their faces, she knew. Noel had given them something. Maybe not the full truth, but enough. Marissa Whitmore, you are under arrest for the murder of Jalen Whitmore. The words echoed in her ears as they pulled her hands behind her back, cold metal snapping around her wrists. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She just stared at the door, knowing exactly who had put her here. Noel, her own daughter. The same daughter she had tried to protect. The same daughter she had destroyed. Marissa was charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution painted her as a jealous, vengeful wife who had snapped. The real motive, the layers of betrayal, the secrets, the revenge, never made it to trial. Noel testified against her mother, but she didn't walk away unscathed. The weight of her silence, her involvement, her choices, it would haunt her for the rest of her life. As for Bishop Warren, he escaped with his reputation intact. Jalen was dead. Marissa was in prison. And the man who started it all walked away untouched. Because in the end, some secrets stay buried, and so ends the tragic story of the unholy secret. A family destroyed by lies, revenge, and the kind of betrayal that leaves scars no one can ever heal. But what do you think? Was Noel right to betray her mother? Should Marissa have taken a different path? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe.